NASA's getting ready for 2 crewed flights in 2 weeks, with an upcoming wet dress rehearsal of the SLS rocket ahead of the Artemis II mission to the Moon, and the completion of training for Crew-12, the next crew rotation mission to the International Space Station. Blue Origin is also preparing to go to the Moon with their Blue Moon lander, while New Shepard stays on the ground, and China is gearing up for an important test of its Lunar Crew spacecraft in the coming weeks. Safe to say, the Moon is having quite a moment here on This Week in Spaceflight, and we've even got an explosion. NASA's Space Launch System rocket and Orion spacecraft for Artemis II are on the launch pad at Launch Complex 39B and getting ready for launch. In last week's episode, we mentioned that the rocket, sitting atop its mobile launcher, had rolled out to the launch site ahead of the launch of Artemis II. Since then, there have been a few things that NASA has done to prepare for flight. Soon after rollout, teams at the Exploration Ground Systems installed and tested the emergency egress system slide wire baskets and completed retraction tests of the crew access arm on the mobile launcher. The solid rocket boosters were also loaded with hydrazine, which is used by their hydraulic power units to provide the power needed to gimbal the SRB nozzles during flight. These preparations have more or less run smoothly, but some issues have still appeared. For example, earlier this week, NASA stated that during testing of the emergency egress system baskets, they stopped short of the terminus area inside the pad perimeter, and teams had to readjust the brakes to ensure that they descend the full length. This week, the crew also went into quarantine while at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, a normal procedure often performed about 2 weeks before every crew launch to prevent anyone from developing any sickness during the mission. Within their quarantine, the crew is still doing some training and going through procedures on their own while they wait for their turn to fly out to Florida and get inside of Orion. But all in all, their training is pretty much done, and as Commander Reed Wiseman says, "There is nothing left on my to-do list. I'm ready to go." Ahead of launch, the agency is planning an all-up wet dress rehearsal, which was initially set for this weekend. Earlier this week, the agency stated that the test would be counting down to a simulated T0 of January 31st at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, which would be February 1st at 2 o'clock UTC. Since then, the agency has moved this by 48 hours due to weather and is now targeting a simulated T0 on February 2nd, but don't be surprised if it keeps slipping. During the wet dress rehearsal, NASA will rehearse every single aspect of the launch countdown, including filling up all tanks on the SLS rocket and running down the countdown milestones close to T0. The only things that won't be rehearsed will be the final few seconds of the count, and the crew will also not be going inside of Orion. The SLS countdown is a long countdown which features 3 built-in holds, one before tanking the rocket, another right after tanking is complete, and a final one before terminal count. The terminal count of SLS begins at T-minus 10 minutes, and it's when a number of critical systems come online and are activated for the first time during the countdown. This includes the activation of the core stage auxiliary power units, which provide the power to gimbal the 4 RS-25 engines on the core stage. It's also the time when the stages are pressurized for flight, the launch abort system is armed, SLS and Orion move into internal power, and a whole lot more. For that reason, NASA has been wanting to test holding the count during that terminal count, recycling back to T-minus 10 minutes and holding, and then resuming the count. It's something that the agency originally tried to do ahead of Artemis I, but due to several issues during the wet dress rehearsal campaign, it wasn't performed. Instead, it's something that they'll test during this campaign ahead of Artemis II. During the first terminal count run-through, the clock will count all the way down to T-minus 1 minute and 30 seconds, which is when the core stage goes into internal power. The plan is to hold the clock at that point in the count for 3 minutes, and then resume the count, simulating a hold late into the terminal count and a resumption of the countdown. After the clocks resume counting, the count will be held once again at the T-minus 33 seconds mark, which is the point when the rocket's onboard computers take over control of the count. After that hold, the clock will run all the way back to T-minus 10 minutes in what is called a recycle of the count. This means that the rocket, spacecraft, and ground systems are returned back to the same state where they were before the terminal count started in the first place, so think about switching back to ground power, resuming propellant replenishment, moving the crew access arm back against Orion, and much more. After holding at T-minus 10 minutes for an undetermined amount of time, the hold will once again be released and the count will run all the way to T-minus 29 seconds, which is when the rocket's automated launch system will stop the count for a final time and conclude the wet dress rehearsal. If you think about it, this testing really puts the rocket, spacecraft, and ground systems through their paces, and it also allows the ground crews to test these unlikely scenarios with actual launch hardware. While the crew will just be watching this wet dress rehearsal from a distance and not going to the pad, the closeout crew will be going to the pad. The team will be rehearsing what they'll do on the day of launch, which includes, for example, configuring the crew access arm and white room for crew arrival, and Orion's cabin for crew ingress. And then, of course, there's the reverse process, where once the crew is on board, they close the hatch on Orion, remove the tooling used for accessing the capsule, then close the hatch on the launch abort system, and prepare the white room for launch. All of that will also be rehearsed during this pre-launch test. NASA has not yet announced a launch attempt, and it's for a good reason. The wet dress rehearsal could be delayed for a multitude of reasons, some not even related to the rocket at all. I mean, it's really cold right now in Florida, and there are temperature constraints as to when they can load the rocket with propellant. The test could also reveal issues that would need time to resolve while it's on the pad, in which case they may also want another rehearsal if it's necessary, or they may even have to go back to the VAB to work on whatever they found during the testing. This is why all that NASA has given us so far is a set of potential launch opportunities for February, March, and April. For Artemis I, the length of time that SLS could spend at the pad was a lot shorter than now because there was no access to the rocket's flight termination system while it was at Launch Complex 39B. This flight termination system has a limited time that it's certified by the Eastern Range, and NASA, as another operator of the Eastern Range, has to follow the range's rules. Because of this, after the late August to early September 2022 launch attempts were scrubbed, NASA had to ask the Eastern Range for a waiver to be able to attempt another launch of Artemis I later in the month on a launch period which would have been in late September. This waiver was approved, but the agency did not go ahead with that late September attempt due to weather and decided instead to roll the rocket back to the vehicle assembly building. SLS then rolled out again in mid-November and finally launched just a few days later without needing any more waivers or a replacement of the flight termination system. For Artemis II, if NASA were to be as unlucky as during Artemis I, they now have access to the rocket's flight termination system while the rocket is sitting on the pad. Therefore, this waiver would not be needed as they have the capability to retest the system while on the pad and recertify it. All of this is to say that even if NASA finds issues on this upcoming pre-launch test, or weather decides to be unfavorable, the rocket may still be on the pad even if the agency is forced to wait until the March launch period to attempt a launch of SLS. Here's hoping that they don't need any of these measures and that we get a smooth countdown. Regardless of what happens, we'll be covering these events live here on NSF as usual. In fact, we've pulled out all the stops, and we'll have live coverage of the wet dress rehearsal, pre-launch live streams previewing the mission, live launch coverage, and many more surprises that you'll find out about if you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any of it. China has unveiled plans for another reusable cargo spacecraft that would service the Tiangong space station and one day perhaps even service a future Lunar Gateway outpost. The plans, published in a spacecraft engineering report, explore a two-module configuration with a reusable module that returns to Earth and a single-use propulsion module. With demand for the Tiangong station growing to beyond 500 kilograms per month in food, supplies, and experiments, China needs a next-generation cargo vehicle that focuses on bidirectional transport. The current Tianzhou craft are one-way expendable transporters, whereas this new design would support returning space-manufactured goods as well as experiments back to Earth. While the cargo capacity of this new design is lower than that of Tianzhou, this is balanced by the reusability and the ability to return cargo from the station. The new craft would be designed to be used at least 10 times and would stay in orbit for up to a year. It would have a launch mass of 10 tons with an upbound cargo capacity of 3,500 kilograms and a down mass of 2,500 kilograms. These are lower than, but more comparable to, SpaceX's Cargo Dragon. Two new spacecraft designs were chosen to service Tiangong as part of China's first commercial cargo resupply contracts back in November 2024. There's been no update on AVIC's Haolong spaceplane for some time, which is planned to launch aboard Landspace's Chuche 3 rocket. The lightweight, smaller Changzhou craft, developed by CAS Space, was, however, expected to launch in the next few months. The craft was due to debut aboard the maiden launch of the company's new Kinetica 2 rocket, but it has been since delayed until the end of this year, possibly also delaying that maiden launch. Elsewhere at the Wenchang Space Launch Center, there are signs that China is preparing for an in-flight abort test of its Mengzhou crewed capsule. The China Manned Space Agency has yet to officially confirm, but industry analysts, tourism companies, and recent activity at the site are all indicating the test could take place around February 11th. A test version of the Changzheng 10A has been seen at Launch Complex 301 with a simulator in place of an upper stage. This pad and launch tower were recently constructed specifically to support launches of the forthcoming Changzheng 10 heavy launcher. This is the rocket that will separately launch China's Crew and lunar lander to the moon before the end of the decade. The Mengzhou, or Dream vessel, is a next-generation crewed spacecraft built for missions into deep space. The Shenzhou craft, which currently transports crew to and from the Tiangong space station, is limited to operations in low Earth orbit. An uncrewed orbital flight of Mengzhou, which would dock with Tiangong, could take place later this year. Before that, a standard prerequisite for certifying a human-rated craft is an in-flight abort test. This would involve launching a test version of the Mengzhou capsule and simulating an escape during the high-stress ascent phase, also known as Max-Q, thus verifying the launch escape system's performance under maximum aerodynamic forces. A prototype of Mengzhou conducted pad abort tests last June at the Zhochuan Launch Center, from where we usually see the Shenzhou missions launch. This tested rapidly pulling the capsule away in a worst-case ground-level scenario. Tests like these are high-risk, as well as sensitive, so it's no surprise that it was only publicized post-flight, and this forthcoming test is no less risky. The pad conducted water deluge tests last week, so we're keeping our eyes on Wenchang for what could be a significant step forward in China's lunar space program. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, continuing with more moon-related stories, this time coming from Blue Origin. Last week, the company rolled its first Blue Moon Mk1 lander out of its Lunar Plant 1 building at the Kennedy Space Center and loaded it on a ship to transport it to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. The ship, called Sarah Bordelon, was docked at Port Canaveral, and we were able to see the operation live on our 24/7 Space Coast livestream as it happened. The vessel left port later that day, and as of recording, it has arrived in Houston, so Blue's lander should have been unloaded by now. The reason why Blue is transporting this to NASA Johnson is that the agency has a thermal vacuum chamber there where Blue will be able to test the lander in conditions similar to what it'll see on its way to the moon. If all goes well with testing, Blue Moon should return to the Kennedy Space Center later in the year for final preparations and rocket integration. It's still unknown what timelines Blue is working with, or on which New Glenn flight this lander will even fly, and because of this, it'll be important to keep track of future updates on the lander's launch preparations. But Blue Moon isn't the only thing that Blue is testing at NASA Johnson. This week, the company released a video of testing of its own docking system, which it calls the Blue Docking System. The testing took place at Johnson Space Center's 6 Degree of Freedom Dynamic Test Facility. In the video, we can see what appears to be a test of an off-nominal scenario where both docking systems aren't fully aligned, but still make contact and capture for a successful docking. If you've watched prior episodes of This Week in Spaceflight, this test facility might look familiar, as it was used a few years ago to test the docking system for SpaceX's Starship human landing system. While the Blue docking system tested here was part of the company's contract for commercial stations in low Earth orbit, Blue says that it'll actually fly first on the company's Blue Moon Mk2 lander. That's the bigger lunar lander and the one that's eventually meant to carry crew on board. What was even more interesting about Blue Origin's wording on that post, though, was the reference to future vehicles, something that implies that there may be other spacecraft that they're working on right now that'll carry that docking system in the future. I wonder what that may be. And now to Ryan for some late-breaking news.
Thanks, Alicia. Whatever those future vehicles may be, it appears they are about to receive more attention as Blue Origin is pausing new Shepard flights for at least 2 years. The company announced this just as I was editing this episode, stating that resources from this program will be redirected to further accelerate its lunar human spaceflight program. This appears to be a response to NASA's call last October to accelerate timelines towards a human landing on the moon by the United States before China gets there first, carrying out its own lunar landing. New Shepard shares some technologies with a lunar lander, as it has to perform a propulsive landing back on the ground. Its main propellants are also hydrogen and oxygen, just like Blue Origin's own lunar landers currently in development, and the company has gained some limited experience handling humans on board the New Shepard capsule. The announcement comes just 8 days after the company carried out the 38th flight of New Shepard. During coverage of that flight, Blue Origin's own commentators claimed that there were a series of capsules and boosters in manufacturing, waiting to debut on later flights, but it now seems that all of this may have to wait. According to Blue Origin, this pause could be, quote, no less than 2 years, which means there is a chance it could be even longer. However, given the uncertainties around the profitability of New Shepard missions and the relative usefulness of the program now that New Glenn has launched and landed, it would not be entirely surprising if New Shepard never flies again. I'm not sure if Virgin Galactic, being the only remaining space tourism company, was on anybody's 2026 bingo card.
A NASA WB-57 performed an unexpected gear-up landing this week at the Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base near NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Keen followers of spaceflight will know that these aircraft are often in the air during certain launches, re-entries, or splashdowns to give NASA additional eyes from the sky. Most recently, you've probably heard us mention the WB-57s taking to the air during Starship launches, but they've also supported launches of the Space Shuttle and Artemis missions, as well as re-entries of the Crew Dragon and Orion capsules, for example. The aircraft will often fly under or near the flight path for close-up data and visuals. The WB-57F Canberra, to give its full name, was originally designed as a high-altitude research aircraft during the Cold War. They typically fly in the upper stratosphere at around 18 to 19 kilometers in altitude, conducting atmospheric science and research. This can include observations during a solar eclipse or studying the impacts of aerosols, rocket exhaust, and the climate on the upper atmosphere. NASA operates the only 3 examples that are still flying, the oldest 2 of which are currently undergoing a major inspection and maintenance process. Well, this week, the only WB-57 that was currently airworthy, with tail number November 927 November Alpha, made a dramatic landing following a routine training flight on January 27th. Video footage shows the plane sliding down runway 17 right, on its belly, producing sparks and flames.
51551, Roger, continue southbound. We had the WB-57 crash on the runway.
Yeah, that's not gonna buff out. NASA confirmed the 2 crew were safe and in good health, and described the problem as a mechanical issue that prevented the gear from deploying. The agency and the FAA will now conduct a thorough investigation, but NASA expects there to be no impact on Artemis II operations. NASA has other aerial assets, such as the Gulfstream 5, Gulfstream 3, and a U.S. Navy C-20 that it can deploy. Of the 2 aircraft currently in the shop, 6 November Alpha is due to be completed next month, so here's hoping that it won't be too long before the WB-57 is airborne once again. The Crew-12 astronauts completed their pre-flight training program this week in California and have now entered quarantine ahead of their mission. Training typically begins 18 to 24 months prior. Crews spend time at SpaceX's facilities in Hawthorne, California, NASA centers, and at other international partner sites. The crew also undergoes extensive training, simulations, and systems rehearsals for the Dragon spacecraft and in preparation for working aboard the International Space Station. This will be SpaceX's 12th operational mission to the ISS under NASA's Commercial Crew program. The mission will carry NASA astronauts Jessica Meir and Jack Hathaway as commander and pilot, respectively, alongside European Space Agency astronaut Sophie Adeneau and Roscosmos cosmonaut Andrei Fedyaev as mission specialists. The crew entered a routine 2-week quarantine on January 28th at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. From there, they'll travel to the Kennedy Space Center around February 6th to continue their pre-launch ops in quarantine. Now, if you're thinking, that sounds awfully close to the Artemis II timeline, you'd be right, and the missions could launch just days apart. The Artemis II crew is also currently in quarantine, with their launch currently scheduled for no earlier than February 8th, pending the vehicle's upcoming wet dress rehearsal. The launch date for Crew-12 was originally February 15th, but was advanced to the earliest opportunity following the early return of Crew-11. It's currently slated to launch no earlier than February 11th, with backup windows on the 12th and 13th. NASA emphasized the need to avoid overlapping these 2 crewed missions in flight for operational reasons, so those dates will remain fluid. Whenever Crew-12 ends up going up into space, we'll definitely be here at NSF covering it live, and of course, on our This Week in Spaceflight episodes. Boom! Stoke Space tested the flight termination system for its Nova rocket this week, and it went off with quite a bang. The system is part of Nova's autonomous flight safety system that will continuously monitor the vehicle in flight, checking its trajectory against predefined safety corridors and limits. If NOVA experiences an anomaly during ascent and deviates, the system would autonomously trigger the termination of the flight without waiting for ground commands. The successful explosive demonstration validates the performance and reliability of this critical safety component. With NOVA aiming for high launch cadence and pushing boundaries with its fully reusable stages, this test ticks off another key milestone on its path to the launch pad. Meanwhile, at the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, Firefly Aerospace has lifted its Alpha vehicle vertically on the pad in preparation for its 7th flight, which will be called Stairway to 7. The rocket was shipped horizontally from the company's Rocket Ranch facility in Briggs, Texas, and was then integrated with the second stage and payload fairing before being raised upright on January 29th. The company will next static fire the 4 Reaver engines on the first stage in preparation for flight. The milestone comes after a prior booster that was preparing for this mission was lost in September during testing at the Rocket Ranch. Alpha's last flight, back in April of last year, also ended in failure after an issue during staging caused the second stage engine nozzle to break and underperform. Flight 7 will also test several subsystems in shadow mode for a block upgrade that Firefly is planning to debut on Alpha's 8th flight. All in all, a lot is riding on this mission, so we wish Firefly the best of luck as they get ready for launch. In the meantime, Firefly is also preparing for the debut of the Antares 330 rocket in collaboration with Northrop Grumman. Firefly is building the first stage for this new vehicle, which will feature 7 of the company's Miranda engines. However, the Antares 330 rocket will keep the same Castor 30XL solid rocket motor as the second stage, just like the previous version of Antares. The same first stage will also be used on the forthcoming Eclipse vehicle, which will switch from a solid to a liquid-fueled second stage. For Antares 330, a special interstage will be needed to join both stages, and this week the company announced that structural testing of this interstage is well underway at their Briggs test site. With every milestone they tick down, the rocket becomes more and more real, and hopefully we'll get to see it on the pad later this year. This is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. This week was dominated once again by SpaceX's Falcon 9. We had a few Starlink launches this week, which means more internet satellites up in space for a lot of users back here on the ground. But that wasn't the interesting thing about these launches. 2 Starlink launches out of Vandenberg flew this week, with what appeared to be patterns of Starship heat shield tiles attached to the active fairing half. This is the fairing half that's facing away from the strong back when the rocket is vertical on the pad. On our latest Starship Update episode, we featured this, and we theorized that these could be part of testing to see that the tiles remain attached during the trip uphill. The company also has a test area at its McGregor test site that may be performing similar testing, but on the ground. It's another reminder that even though they may seem boring, Starlink launches can always surprise us with something new and interesting. Another one of the Falcon 9 launches this week was the launch of the GPS-3 Space Vehicle 9 satellite for the U.S. Space Force. The satellite is the 9th of the GPS third-generation satellite constellation, and it's named after Ellison Onizuka, a NASA astronaut and one of the crew members who lost their lives on board Challenger during the STS-51L mission just 40 years before this launch took place. This mission marks the 3rd time that the U.S. Space Force switched rides for a GPS satellite from Vulcan to Falcon 9 due to Vulcan's initial development delays and later because of the SRB nozzle issue during its 2nd flight. On each occasion, the Space Force has compensated for this by moving around future GPS missions between a SpaceX rocket and a ULA rocket to the point that, to be honest, it's actually becoming a bit complicated to keep track of now. Out of New Zealand, we also had the 2nd Electron launch of the year with the Bridging the Swarm mission. The launch carried the 2nd prototype satellite as part of the NeonSat Earth Observation Satellite constellation being developed by the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. Next week, we'll have up to 3 more Starlinks in the schedule, 2 from Vandenberg and 1 from Florida. We may also have a Soyuz launch with a classified satellite from Plesetsk. Notices have also started to appear for the deorbit and reentry of Vast's Haven demo spacecraft, which is nearing the end of its mission. And in the really lucky event that the Artemis II Wet Dress Rehearsal goes well in the next few days, the earliest launch opportunity for that mission could be right after next week's episode. That's just another reason to always check nextspaceflight.com or download the Next Spaceflight app on your phone to keep track of when launches might happen or to see if they end up delaying. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.